You're listening to History by Firelight, where forgotten stories are told softly to guide you into sleep. The Lighthouse Keeper's Vigil, a story for sleep. Settle into a comfortable position. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. Tonight, let this story unfold slowly. There was a lighthouse on a cliff where few people ever went. The keeper's name was Thomas. He had lived there for 17 years, so long that the sounds of crowded streets had faded from his memory, along with the feeling of being hurried. What remained was the wind against stone and the endless, patient rhythm of the sea far below. This is a story about the night he was not alone. It began, as most things do in lighthouses, with routine. Thomas climbed the spiral stairs as he had climbed them every evening for nearly 2 decades. His hand moved along the cold iron railing, worn smooth by the touch of his own palm, again and again, year after year. The steps curved upward in that patient, eternal spiral, and his footsteps echoed softly in the narrow space, a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. The wind that night was gentle, not the violent wind of autumn storms that shook the glass at the top of the tower, but something quieter, a steady breath from the northeast, carrying the salt smell of deep water and the distant memory of land he could no longer see. It was the kind of wind that felt almost like companionship after so many solitary evenings. Thomas was 53 years old. His hair had gone mostly gray. His hands, which once belonged to a different life, a life in a city where he had worked in a printer's shop, now belonged entirely to the lighthouse. They knew the railing. They knew the temperature of the lamp oil. They knew the exact pressure needed to turn the great lens so that the light would turn smoothly, steadily, never faltering. But there was something else that night, something small enough that Thomas almost didn't notice it at first. As he reached the lamp room at the top of the tower, he paused. The beam was steady, rotating as it always did, casting its light outward across the dark water. The glass was clean. The mechanism hummed its familiar, nearly silent hum. Everything was exactly as it should be. Yet something felt different. Thomas moved to the western window and looked out toward the horizon. The sea was a sheet of black velvet, visible only where the beam touched it. And there, only as a brief silver flash before darkness reclaimed the waves. Beyond that, nothing. Just the endless boundary between water and sky, marked only by a slightly lighter shadow against the black. He stood there for a long time, his weathered hands resting on the cold stone windowsill. The lighthouse had no visitors. The supply boat came once a month. The nearest village was 6 miles inland, and the few people who lived there had stopped asking questions about Thomas years ago. He was simply the lighthouse keeper, a fixture, a function. Can you imagine what it means to be unseen for so long that you almost forget yourself? That was when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the wind. A shift in the pressure against the glass. Something had altered in the rhythm of the night. Thomas turned slowly from the window. His instinct told him nothing was wrong. The lamp was steady. The mechanism was sound. The light would reach the fishing boats, the merchant vessels, anyone on the dark water who needed to know where the rocks were, where safety lay. But still, something called to him. He descended the spiral stairs more slowly than usual, his hand trailing along the iron rail. The towers seemed to breathe around him, that particular cold, close air that existed nowhere else in the world except inside a lighthouse. It carried traces of salt from decades of storms. It held the faint copper smell of the mechanism oil. It held, somehow, the memory of every night he had ever spent in this place. At the base of the tower, Thomas lit his lamp. a smaller lamp, not the great beacon, and stepped outside. The night was clearer than he had expected. The stars were visible, though not bright. The moon had not yet risen, but he could feel it approaching, still hidden beyond the curve of the earth. The wind moved gently through his clothes, and he realized he was holding his breath. The path down the cliff was treacherous. Thomas knew every stone of it, knew which ones were loose, which ones were slick even on dry nights. He had walked this path countless times in daylight, and several times at night, but never without a reason. Tonight, he had no reason except the feeling that something had changed. His boots found the familiar holds. The path descended in a series of tight switchbacks, carved into the cliff face over decades by keepers before him. Below, though he could not see it in the darkness, the sea waited. Patient, eternal. But the most important part of the night has not been told yet. What Thomas found at the bottom of the cliff, where the rocks met the tide line, was not what he expected. It was a small boat, wooden, old. It lay on its side among the boulders, half in the water, half out. And in the shallow pool beside it, slumped against the rock, was a person. At first, Thomas thought they were dead. The body didn't move. The clothes, rough wool, salt-stained, clung to his still form. The face, turned away from him, was pale in the darkness, visible only in the thin light that penetrated even here, this low place where the lighthouse beam passed by without touching. Thomas moved toward them slowly, his old heart moving in a pattern it hadn't followed in so long he'd nearly forgotten the feeling. Concern, purpose, the strange electricity of another human being close enough to touch. He knelt down carefully, his knees protesting, and placed his hand on the stranger's shoulder. The body jerked, a sharp, gasping breath. The person's eyes opened, wide, terrified, and they stared up at Thomas with the expression of someone pulled from a nightmare into something equally uncertain. "Easy," Thomas said. His voice came out rough. He hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. "Easy. You're safe now." The stranger, a woman, he could see now, continued to stare at him. She was younger than him, perhaps 40, with dark hair plastered to her skull. She was shaking violently, and not just from a cold. "The boat," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper. Where's the boat?" Thomas gestured toward the small vessel, still half submerged, caught between the rocks as if the sea had set it down deliberately, gently like a gift. "There, you're at the base of the lighthouse cliff. You've washed ashore." He paused. "Do you think you can stand?" She tried. Her legs folded beneath her immediately, and Thomas caught her, surprising himself with the strength that remained in his aging body. He had not held another human being in 17 years. The sensation was overwhelming. The weight, the warmth, the reality of flesh and bone, and another soul pressing against his own. Together, slowly, they made their way back up the path. It took them nearly an hour to climb to the top. The woman. Her name was Eleanor, though she offered this only in fragments between gasping breaths, could barely move her legs. Thomas suspected she had been in the water for hours. Her body was in that strange state of cold exhaustion where the mind begins to separate from the physical form, drifting slightly, as if preparing for something final. He got her to the lighthouse, to the small room where he lived, the one room that was warm, heated by the small stove where he prepared his simple meals. He wrapped her in every blanket he had, 3 of them, worn thin by years of use, and sat her near the stove. "Stay awake," he said. "Look at me. Keep your eyes open." She nodded, teeth chattering so violently he thought they might break. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Her hands shook as she held them out toward the stove's warmth. "What happened?" Thomas asked. "Your boat. How did it come to be at the rocks?" Eleanor's eyes focused slowly on his face. She seemed to be seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, as if her consciousness was only now returning to the world of the present. "Storm," she said. Her voice was barely intelligible. It came so suddenly. One moment we were sailing calm, and then... "We?" Thomas asked. "There were others." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they held something new, something like grief. "My husband," she said. "My husband was with me." Thomas felt something shift in the room. The comfortable silence of the lighthouse, the silence he had inhabited for so long, suddenly felt fragile, permeable, as if the walls themselves had become thinner. "Where is he now?" Thomas asked carefully. Eleanor looked down at her hands. The answer was in her silence. She fell asleep before the fire an hour later. Thomas watched her breathe, slow, steady breaths that gradually deepened as exhaustion claimed her. Her color was returning, marginally. The violent shaking had subsided to occasional tremors. She was alive, at least. She was here. Thomas sat in his chair, the chair where he sat every night when not attending the lamp, and tried to remember what it felt like to share a room with another person. The memory seemed to belong to someone else's life, distant, carefully filed away. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its faithful rotation, the light that he had tended for 17 years, the light that must never fail, that must never falter, because somewhere out on the dark water, ships depended on it, lives depended on it. And somewhere in the dark, in the cold, in the deep places where the light could not reach, Eleanor's husband depended on it no longer. When morning came, Eleanor woke with a start, as if someone had called her name. She looked around the small room with confusion, and then the memory returned to her face. Her expression crumpled like paper. "I need to tell you," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had been the night before, but there was something broken in it, something that might never fully repair. "I need to tell you what happened." Thomas nodded slowly. He made tea. Weak tea, made from leaves he'd been saving for a special occasion that had never quite arrived, and they sat together in the morning light that came through the small window, the gray light of late autumn, the light that promised nothing but the slow approach of winter. And Eleanor began to tell him her story. She and her husband, Edmund, had been sailing from Cork to Bristol. They were not wealthy people, she explained. They were what you might call merchants of modest means. They bought and sold things, cloth, tea, sometimes books. They had been married for 23 years. "We had no children," Eleanor said. The tea had grown cold in her hands, untouched. That was always a sorrow to him. He always wanted a son. Someone to inherit whatever he managed to build. Thomas said nothing. He understood, in a vague way, what it meant to desire something that would not come. He had desired many things before the lighthouse. He had desired differently after. This trip was supposed to be profitable, Eleanor continued. We had invested in a cargo of Spanish wine. Edmund said it was the opportunity we had been waiting for. That if this succeeded, we could build something larger. Perhaps move inland. Open a proper shop instead of trading from our small house. She finally lifted the tea to her lips, then set it down again without drinking. The storm came from nowhere. One moment the sky was merely clouded, and the next, the wind was screaming. The boat was so small, you see. We were not prepared for such fury. Her voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were watching the events unfold rather than speaking of them. The sail tore. Edmund tried to secure it, and the rope caught his leg. Thomas waited. He knew somehow that there was more. I tried to help him, Eleanor said, but the boat was pitching so violently. It was not the sea anymore. It was chaos. It was alive and hungry, and she trailed off. When she spoke again, her voice was very small. He told me to go below. He said he would join me once he had freed his leg. She looked at Thomas with eyes that held oceans of sorrow. But he never came, she said. The boat capsized. I was thrown into the water. I held onto a piece of wood. I held onto it, and I called for Edmund, but she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Thomas found himself in a position he had never expected to occupy again. He became a caretaker, not of a lighthouse, but of a person. Eleanor remained with him through that winter. It was not a situation that could easily be explained to the supply boat captain, so Thomas simply kept her presence quiet. She stayed in the small tower, hidden during the supply deliveries. The captain, an old man named Murray, who had been making the run for 30 years, asked no questions. Perhaps he suspected. Perhaps he simply understood that some things were better left unexamined. Eleanor healed, physically. The color returned to her cheeks. The shaking stopped. Her hair, when properly combed, was a deep brown, threaded with silver. She was, Thomas found, a woman of quiet intelligence. She could read. He had a few books, old books, volumes left behind by keepers long dead, and she read them slowly, carefully, as if each word was a small gift. But something inside her remained broken in a way that time could not fully mend. She would stand at the window of the lamp room, looking out at the sea, and Thomas learned to recognize the particular stillness of her face when her mind had traveled into that storm, back to the moment when the rope caught, when Edmund did not return. "Do you know what I think about most?" she asked him once, in late December, when the days had become so short that darkness seemed to consume nearly all the light the world could offer. "What?" Thomas asked. "I think about how I lived," Eleanor said, "and how he died, and I cannot understand why. We were both in the same water. We were both thrown from the same boat. What determined that I should float and he should sink? What is the calculus of survival?" Thomas had no answer. He had lived in this lighthouse for so long, maintaining the light, understanding that ships survived or perished based on whether they saw the beam. But he could not explain why one person's life continued and another's ended. The universe did not seem to run on logic. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "there is no reason. Perhaps it is simply the way of things." Eleanor turned from the window. "Do you believe that?" Thomas considered the question honestly. "I believe that asking why causes more suffering than accepting what is." "Is that wisdom?" she asked. "Or is it simply resignation?" He did not answer. Winter deepened. The wind became sharper. The supply boat came less frequently, only once in January, once in February. The sea grew rough and hostile, and the light became even more critical. Thomas climbed the stairs to the lamp room twice daily now, checking the mechanism, ensuring the oil was fresh, that the glass was clean. The work was constant. Eleanor began to help him. At first, Thomas resisted. The work was his responsibility, his role, but Eleanor insisted, and eventually he realized that she needed the work as much as he did. It gave her mind something to occupy itself with besides memory and loss. She learned to clean the great lens. She learned to check the mechanism. She learned, as Thomas had learned so many years ago, that there was a rhythm to the work, a meditation in the repetition. By March, they had developed routines that felt almost natural, as if Eleanor had always belonged in the lighthouse, as if her presence was not an exception, but simply part of the order of things. One evening, as they were preparing the lamp for the night, Eleanor said, "I want to tell you about Edmund, about who he was. Not how he died, but how he lived." Thomas paused in his work. "If you wish to." "I think I need to," Eleanor said. "I think if I don't, I will forget. I will only remember the ending, and he deserves to be remembered for more than that." So Thomas set down his tools, and Eleanor sat on the small bench in the lamp room. And as the light began to rotate and the beam swept out across the darkening sea, she spoke of her husband. She spoke of how he laughed, a great, full laugh that seemed to come from deep in his belly. She spoke of how he was terrified of birds, which was a strange fear for a sailor, but he could not abide the sudden movement of wings. She spoke of how he would sometimes spend hours arranging the books on their small shelves, moving them around, creating new patterns, never quite satisfied but always engaged in the process. She spoke of how he held her hand when they walked through Cork, how he remembered exactly how she liked her tea, with honey and just a touch of cinnamon, how he had wanted so desperately to create something that would outlast him, something that would prove he had existed, that he had mattered. He thought a child would be that something, Eleanor said softly. Something of him that would continue. But perhaps he thought that because he didn't understand that he already did matter. To me, to the people he had helped and traded with over the years, to anyone who had ever laughed at one of his jokes or been moved by his kindness. Thomas listened. He thought about the concept of matching. He thought about 17 years of keeping a light that guided ships safely through the dark. He thought about whether he had mattered in all that time, whether anything he did had changed the world, or if he had simply been a function, a mechanism no different than the gears that turned the great lands. "I think," Eleanor continued, "that we spend our lives believing we must create something magnificent to matter. But perhaps simply having lived, simply having loved and been loved, is enough." The light continued to rotate. The beam continued to sweep. And below them, on the dark water, a fishing boat saw the light and was guided safely past the rocks. But neither Thomas nor Eleanor knew about that. They never would know about most of the ships that were guided safely by the light they tended. The lighthouse saves lives quietly. It asks for no thanks. It keeps no record of its successes. Perhaps that was the true nature of matching, to give what was needed without requiring acknowledgement. Spring came slowly. The days grew longer. The wind began to carry different smells, green smells, growing smells, the approaching world of budding things and new life. One evening in April, Eleanor said to Thomas, "I think I must leave." Thomas felt something in his chest shift. He did not answer immediately. He continued to work, cleaning the glass of the lamp, but his hands had become slower, more deliberate. "I understand," he said finally. "No," Eleanor said. "I don't think you do. I don't think I've explained properly." She paused. "I cannot stay here forever. This place, it has healed something in me. The quiet, the work, the sense of tending to something that matters. But I'm not you, Thomas. I cannot make peace with solitude the way you have. And more than that, Thomas prompted, more than that, I owe it to Edmund to live, to go back to Cork, to close our house properly, to settle his affairs, to speak to the people who knew him, to acknowledge that he existed. I cannot do that here." Thomas set down the cloth he had been using. He looked at Eleanor, standing in the lamp room, the rotating light casting her face alternately into brightness and shadow. She looked stronger than she had when he found her. The grief had not left her face, but it had changed. It had become integrated into her, like a scar that no longer caused pain, but remained as a permanent mark. When? He asked. The supply boat comes in 3 days, Eleanor said. I've decided to go with it. The 3 days passed in a strange, suspended state. Thomas and Eleanor did not speak about the parting very much. Instead, they moved through the routines of the lighthouse as they always did, and in the spaces between work, they sat together without speaking, or Eleanor read aloud from the old books, or they walked the narrow path around the tower, looking out at the sea that was becoming calmer as spring advanced. On the last evening, Eleanor asked Thomas a question. Do you regret it? She asked. Staying here? Spending 17 years tending a light. Thomas thought about this carefully. He thought about the man he had been before the lighthouse, the printer, the man who lived in a city, the man who had people around him constantly, but who was paradoxically far more alone than he had ever been in the lighthouse. No, he said, I do not regret it. I have learned things here that I could have learned nowhere else. What things? Eleanor asked. That presence is not the same as connection, Thomas said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. That solitude can be a choice that brings peace rather than an imprisonment. That the smallest actions, keeping a light burning, ensuring a mechanism functions, can have consequences that ripple outward in ways you never see and never know about. He paused, and that sometimes, when you least expect it, another person can arrive in your life and remind you that you are human, that you are capable of caring. Eleanor took his hand. It was the first time she had done so, and Thomas felt it as a profound gesture, a compression of all that had passed between them into a single point of contact. When the supply boat came the next morning, Eleanor was ready. She had packed the few clothes she had worn in the lighthouse. She had asked Thomas for one of the old books, the one she had read most often, a slim volume of poetry by someone Thomas had never heard of. He gave it to her gladly. As she stepped down into the boat, she looked back at the lighthouse, at Thomas standing at the top of the path. Thank you, she called up to him, for saving my life. Thomas wanted to tell her that she had saved his as well, in a way that had nothing to do with physical rescue. But the moment passed too quickly, and the boat was pulling away, and Eleanor turned to face forward, toward Cork, toward whatever life was waiting for her beyond this cliff. The lighthouse keeper stood alone and watched until the boat disappeared into the morning haze. The lighthouse seemed different after Eleanor left. Quieter, perhaps. Or perhaps it had always been this quiet, and Thomas had simply forgotten how to recognize quietness as a presence rather than an absence. He moved through the routines. He climbed the stairs. He tended the lamp. He kept the light burning. But something had shifted in him. Or perhaps something had shifted in his understanding of what the light meant. The beam that swept across the dark water every night was not just a mechanical function. Thomas understood now. It was a gesture. It was a reaching out into the darkness and saying, I am here. You're not alone. I see the dangers that you face, and I am trying to help. Was that not what all presence was in the end? A reaching out into the darkness? Eleanor, on the boat back to Cork, read the slim volume of poetry. She read poems about loss and change, and the strange way that meeting another person could transform your understanding of yourself. One of the poems seemed to be about her. The stranger who arrives in your darkest hour carries no promise of salvation, only the simple fact of their presence, which turns out to be everything. She thought of Thomas, alone in the lighthouse. She wondered if he understood that he was no longer truly alone, that she would carry him with her, the quiet steadiness of him, the way he had asked no questions, the way he had simply accepted her into his solitude and allowed her to remain there as long as she needed. She wondered if, someday, she might find a way to return to the lighthouse, to bring him word of how she was faring, to demonstrate to him that her survival had meaning, that Edmund's memory was being honored not through grand gestures, but through the simple act of continuing to live, to work, to seek connection. But she also understood that perhaps the lighthouse was his place, not hers. Perhaps it was enough to know that it had existed for her when she needed it, and that she would exist in memory for Thomas for as long as he climbed those stairs. Years passed. Thomas continued to tend the light. New supply boat captains came. They asked no questions about the keeper they occasionally glimpsed at the top of the cliff. To the world, Thomas remained the lighthouse keeper, a fixture, a function, a mechanism that ensured ships found their way safely through the dark. But Thomas himself had changed. He understood now that he had never truly been alone, even in the 17 years before Eleanor arrived. The ships that saw his light and were guided safely past the rocks, they were a form of presence. The connection was real, even if invisible, even if he never knew their names or faces. And after Eleanor left, he became aware of the infinite ways that human beings reach out to each other across distances and through time. The books she had left behind, the memory of her voice reading poetry in the lamp room, the knowledge that somewhere in Cork she was alive and living and carrying a piece of this lighthouse with her, just as he carried a piece of her. In October of the year after Eleanor's departure, a letter arrived with the supply boat. Thomas's name was written on it in a careful hand. The letter had been forwarded from his previous address, passed through multiple hands before finally reaching the lighthouse. Eleanor wrote, "My dear Thomas, I hope this letter finds you well. It has taken me many months to find your address, and many more to find the courage to write. I write to tell you that I have opened a small bookshop in Cork. It is not large, and it will never make me wealthy, but brings me satisfaction. People come to purchase books, and sometimes they stay to talk, and in those conversations, I find a kind of connection that I did not know I was seeking. Asterisk, asterisk, I have told the story of how I came to own this shop to anyone who has asked. I tell them about the storm, about Edmund, about the lighthouse, about the quiet man who saved me and asked nothing in return. I tell them that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones. The moments when another person simply remains present and asks us to remain present as well. Asterisk, asterisk, I have named the shop the Lighthouse. It seemed fitting. Asterisk, asterisk, I do not know if I will ever return to the cliff where you stand watch. I do not know if life will carry me in that direction, but I know that I am grateful for you, and for the knowledge that somewhere on a cliff above the sea, you are still keeping the light burning. Asterisk with warm regards, asterisk Eleanor asterisk." Thomas read the letter many times. He kept it carefully, folded and placed in a small wooden box beneath his bed. On nights when the wind was particularly lonely, or when the sea seemed particularly vast, he would take it out and read Eleanor's words again. And he understood that this was how people mattered to each other, not through grand gestures or monuments, but through these small threads of connection that remained, even across distance and time. Eleanor had named her bookshop after the lighthouse. In doing so, she had made it immortal. She had ensured that Thomas's light, and the light of every keeper who had come before him, would be remembered and honored in the quiet way that such things are honored. Through story, through conversation, through the simple act of transmitting meaning forward into the world. On the night of Eleanor's final message to Thomas, though neither of them knew it would be final. A young man arrived at the bookshop in Cork. He was looking for a particular book, a volume of poetry. The shopkeeper, Eleanor, helped him find it. As he was preparing to leave, he asked her why the shop was called the Lighthouse. Eleanor told him the story. She told him about the storm, about Edmund, about Thomas. She told him about the cliff and the light that turned through the darkness every night, guiding ships safely past the rocks. The young man listened carefully. When Eleanor finished, he said, "That is a beautiful story. I am a writer, you see. I collect stories. Would you mind if I wrote this one down? If I tried to preserve it?" Eleanor thought of Thomas, alone in the lighthouse, keeping the light burning. She thought of how stories were another kind of light. They illuminated the darkness of forgetting. They guided people through the confusion of their lives. They connected strangers to each other across vast distances. "Please," she said, "please do write it down." And so it was that the story began to spread. It was published in a small journal. It was shared from person to person. It became a kind of legend. The lighthouse keeper and the woman he saved, and the way that one night of connection had rippled outward, changing both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Some versions of the story changed details. In some tellings, Eleanor and Thomas fell in love. In others, they were siblings separated by life. In still others, they were simply two souls who recognized in each other the particular loneliness of existence and decided, for a time, to be less lonely together. None of these versions were quite true, but all of them were true in the way that stories are true. They captured something essential about what it means to be human. They captured the hunger for connection, the fear of isolation, the way that a single act of kindness can echo forward through time in ways we never anticipate. Thomas never knew that his story had become a story. He continued to climb the stairs. He continued to tend the light. He grew older, and his hair became completely white, and his hands became gnarled with arthritis, but still he climbed the stairs. And every ship that saw his light and was guided safely past the rocks was a kind of answer to a question that Thomas had stopped asking long ago. Does any of this matter? The answer was yes. It mattered. Not because Thomas knew about the ships. Not because he received thanks or recognition. It mattered simply because he kept showing up night after night and kept the light burning. And that was enough. In the final year of Thomas's life, though again, he did not know it was the final year, a very old woman made the journey to the lighthouse. She arrived on a supply boat in late September. Her name was Eleanor. Thomas did not recognize her at first. 50 years had passed since he had found her washed up among the rocks. She was an old woman now, as old as Thomas was. Her hair was entirely white. Her face held the map of decades written across it. But when she spoke, Thomas heard the echo of the woman he had known. "Hello," Eleanor said. "I told you once that I did not know if I would return. I have come to tell you that I have lived a full life since I left this place. I have lived it well. I have read many books and helped many people find the books they needed. I have spoken of you and of this lighthouse to anyone who would listen. I have honored the memory of Edmund and the gift of my own survival." Thomas took her hand. His grip was weak now, but it was genuine. "I'm glad," he said. They sat together in the lamp room one last time. They watched the sun set, and they watched the first stars emerge. And when the light began to turn, casting its beam across the darkening water, they sat in silence together and understood that this moment, this quiet, unremarkable moment of presence, was the sum of everything that mattered. The light turned. The sea waited below, and somewhere out on the dark water, Ships saw the beam and knew where the rocks were, and were guided safely forward. This is how the story ends, though it is not really an ending. It is simply a pause. Eleanor and Thomas remained in the lighthouse through that autumn and into the early winter. They did not speak very much. They did not need to. They had said what needed to be said decades ago in the simple fact of showing up, of remaining present, of tending to a light that burned in the darkness. When Eleanor eventually left the lighthouse, this time, finally and peacefully, Thomas continued to climb the stairs. He continued to keep the light burning. And when his own time came to rest, another keeper took his place, and the light continued to turn as it had turned before, as it would continue to turn long after everyone who had known Thomas and Eleanor had passed from the world. The light turned in the darkness. It asked nothing. It required nothing. It simply existed, and in existing, it saved lives. And perhaps that is the greatest love story that can ever be told. Not the story of two people who meet and change each other's lives, though that happened here, but the story of a light that keeps burning night after night, in service to those who have never known its name. The light turns, the sea remains, and in the quiet space between them, the lighthouse stands, eternal and patient, waiting for the next person who might need its guidance. Waiting for you, perhaps, to know that you are never truly alone, even in the darkest night. The light is there. It has always been there, and it will remain. You can rest now. The light will keep burning through the night. The lighthouse is keeping watch.